Thank you so much for joining us today for the final webinar in this series on autism and mental health. The plan for today is that we will be hearing from our guest speaker and then have a question and answer period. So please use the chat for any comments. And also, again, a reminder that this is being recorded and will be shared publicly. So please keep private information out of the chat. As Yana said, my name is Riley Goldsmith. I'm comfortable using any pronouns, and I am a youth engagement specialist as well as an autistic advisor and self-advocate at CAMH. I work to further education and understanding of the intersection of disability and mental health from both a professional and lived experience perspective. Now, I would like to introduce our guest speaker for today. Dr. Alan Martino is an assistant professor in the Community Rehabilitation and Disability Studies program in the Department of Community Health Sciences at the University of Calgary. His main research interests are in critical disability studies, gender and sexualities, feminist and critical disability studies theories, and qualitative and community-based research, particularly participatory and inclusive research methodologies. His work has been published in multiple journals, including, for example, Disability Studies Quarterly, Sexuality and Disability, and Culture, Health and Sexuality, as well as edited volumes focused on disability and/or sexuality studies. He has guest edited 3 special issues, and he is currently working on 2 edited books. He is the lead of the Disability and Sexuality Lab at the University of Calgary. Without further ado, welcome Dr. Martino, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for this warm welcome. It's always strange having to listen about my own bio, but thank you so much for having me. Please do call me Alan throughout this presentation. And this is really meant to be much more interactive, so I will make you work a little bit at some points. So please do use the chat box to answer some questions, and we're going to have some competition because I love competitions. And hopefully we can learn a little bit more about this topic of disability and sexuality, especially in the context of online dating. That is one of the biggest areas of requests that I get from community partners these days. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen here, and I'm going to put full screen. Please give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Wonderful. Thank you. So again, thank you so much for having me. The goal for today is, first of all, I want to share some quotes from interviews that I did with people with disabilities in our community here in Alberta. And people talked about their experiences with virtual dating, some of the barriers, but also some of the positive experiences. We're going to do a few fun activities along the way. So we'll be testing your knowledge about sexy emojis and online dating. Be prepared. Then we're going to talk a little bit about potential resources or tips to navigate these questions. One of the things that I always like to note is that you don't need to wait until the end to ask any questions. I won't be bothered. We have an amazing team here, facilitators, keeping an eye on the chat box today, so thank you. Feel free to share questions or thoughts throughout, and I will be asking for your participation too. One of the first questions I like to get right off the gate is, who am I? A lot of people are always curious about what made you interested in looking at this intersection of disability and sexuality. And I would say multiple different kinds of angles. One, I grew up with an older sibling with a disability. And certainly growing up in a family with someone with a disability made me aware not only of some of the challenges that he has faced when it comes to forming intimate relationships, but most importantly, the challenges of other family members, like my parents, who felt really uncomfortable talking about this topic. And it made me realize that we were so comfortable working with my sibling in terms of advocating for his rights about employment, education, health, everything else. But when it came to sexual health or sexuality, we didn't feel as confident talking about that right or those kinds of part of his life. So there was a silence there that I thought it was significant. Also, in my work with various community organizations that provide services to people with disabilities and family members and caregivers, I never forget one particular day where we were doing this kind of improvisation exercise with people with disabilities on stage. And this young man with an intellectual disabilities is doing a scene, and he says something like, these are his words: "Love is natural, we all love." The audience, made of other people with disabilities, volunteers, staff member, we all felt very comfortable. I think I even heard someone in the audience be like, "Oh." But then, just like a few minutes later, the same young man says, "Sex, that's what I want." And now that completely changed the energy in the room. I could see people staring at each other, clueless about how to address that moment or that line in the scene. I could hear some awkward giggling or some people just in silence. And then, after some moments of hesitation, the person who was facilitating the session, a direct care worker, basically says, "Isn't the weather beautiful today?" and completely ends the scene, and that's it. And I thought, here's a young man saying something that is really important in his life and something that is very natural and normal in our everyday lives. And yet, we treated this topic as the elephant in the room that we chose to ignore, that was just seen as unacceptable to be talked about. So that also made me really interested in becoming a researcher and trying to see, are there better ways that we can support people with disabilities, workers, organizations, families, caregivers, so we can have these conversations in an easier way, in more productive ways. So this gives you a little bit of a background. One of the things that I like to already admit, because I'm giving this presentation about online dating, yes, I have been on dating websites before. I've used it. I've met people online. So I bring my own kind of lived experience navigating the spaces too, which is always fascinating. So first of all, I'm going to ask you for your participation here. In one word, no more than that, what comes to your mind when you think about online dating? Can you let us know in the chat box? In one word. Love, useful, anxiety, manufactured, yeah, for sure. Exhausting, exhausting, shopping, interesting. Superficial, scary, uncertainty, yeah, gamified. It's interesting the words like game, especially in competition. Yeah. Vulnerability, commercialization of self. Wow, you folks are like pros at this. Lying, impression. So as you can see, we use all kinds of different words to describe our experience with online dating. Some people see as potentially opening up for a negative experience, like harassment, vulnerability, right? Shallow experiences. But others find that this is the only space that they might have to potentially find partners, to explore their sexuality and sexual desires, find communities. So it's always a mixed bag, right? As you can imagine. In this presentation, I'm going to say right away, I'm not here to convince anyone like go online dating. No. What I'd like to acknowledge is that online dating is great for some folks, but not good for others. And that's how it works. So for you, it's really thinking about what works best for you, right? What is comfortable for you, and what your experiences are. One of the things that for sure when we look at the literature, we know that technology has now become such a big part of our lives. We can do almost everything online, right? Order products, use social media, communicate with others, do so much online. Even especially during the pandemic times, it became even more important for a lot of people who had access to technology. Of course, some people don't have access to technology, and that's a big barrier. But for folks that did have access to technology during the pandemic, that was one of the ways to kind of keep some sense of connection with others in a time of extreme social isolation. I remember even People First Canada, right? This huge organization, they wrote this amazing piece where they said that people with disabilities, and especially intellectual disabilities, felt like they were left behind after left behind during the pandemic. And I can see that. So what I like to see is that everyone should have at least the opportunity to explore and enjoy the possibilities that this digital age now offers to people. Now, I'm not going to lie, right? Online dating can feel scary, overwhelming, exhausting. Words that you folks are already brought up, right? It certainly opens ourselves to strangers. opens ourselves to faceless profiles, awkward situations, awkward dates that you're like, oh my God, please someone call me so I can get out of this. And not that I'm speaking from personal experience. But what we know from research too is that it's estimated that by 2035, more people will meet their partners online than offline. So it's undoubtable, right, that online dating is here to stay and is going to continue making more and more impact in terms of how we connect with partners, how we have relationships. Have people seen episodes of the TV show Black Mirror? Some people find them very scary because they're so realistic, even though they're meant to be fiction. But there are lots of episodes that kind of try to address this already, like the future of dating through technology. So, what I would say is that sometimes there are things we can do to try to make our experiences in online dating safe and a little bit more positive. But of course, as I already mentioned, it's not for everyone, and that's totally fine. Now, what do I mean by online dating? Usually, we're talking about both mobile applications and dating websites. And what I like to kind of mention here is there are more generalized kind of websites and apps. So those are meant for anyone and anyone can join, and it's kind of like just open. So we're talking about Plenty of Fish, Tinder, OkCupid, and websites like eHarmony, Match.com. But we also now, and this is what research about sexuality shows us, is that we're living in an age where sexualities are becoming much more niche and more specialized. So now we find communities that are based on very specific desires or communities. Now, if you Google this, you can find websites, for example, Christian Mingle, if you really find it important to connect with other folks who are Christian. But it doesn't end there. There are websites like Dating Farmers Only, Dating Tattoo People Only. There are people who, if you like boots, you can find other people who are also passionate about boots and connect and make that connection. Like, so that's what we're experiencing now, much more specialized. And what we see too is that this specialization has also reached disability. So now we have multiple, like dozens of websites that specialize on people with disabilities and dating. Some of these websites are even very expensive, specific in the sense that they might be like LGBT and disability, or they might be focused on particular forms of disability even. So that's what we're experiencing now. We know that online dating is becoming a very popular way of meeting partners and starting relationships. Can you believe there are over 8,000 dating websites around the world right now available to us? So it's almost this idea that we can always find a website that works for us or that kind of fits our, desires, our niche desires. We know that most websites and apps are free, and it's somewhat safe, is what people say. So, for example, users now in some apps and dating websites have to verify their accounts, really make sure that they are who they say they are, right? They might need to show their IDs and prove that their name and photo actually match their IDs. So, websites and apps, they're trying to show an image that they're safer spaces now, right? Or even, for example, some apps, they only allow certain people to take the first step. So only women, for example, in those apps are able to take the first step, and if they are interested in someone, then the other person can respond. So apps are trying to do something to address some of the concerns we have. Now, here's another question for you folks. What concerns do you have when it comes to, more specifically, disability and online dating? Let us know in the chat box. Risk of exploitation, absolutely. Accessibility is a big issue, absolutely. Being accepted, believed, disclosure timing, that was a big issue in our study, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Preying on people, disclosure again, yes. People had a lot of questions about when to disclose and how to disclose, right? Absolutely. But also the work that goes into educating people about disability over and over and over again, and how exhausting it can be. Yes. So, what we know from research is that people with disabilities are engaging in online dating. We know that. But I wanted to understand the nuances here. How are people actually experiencing this? So I did an exploratory study looking at the intimate lives of people labeled with developmental and intellectual disabilities in the community. I conducted interviews with 46 participants in total, and 15 of them talked about online dating specifically. So those are the ones that we're going to focus on today. Let's talk about some of the findings. So first of all is the barriers to access. The finances was a big piece. And this is because some of the apps and websites, they require subscriptions and payments, especially if you want to upgrade and have more options and be able to do more things in those websites. So for example, Alejandro says, I hear about this website, match.com, but it costs money. They're saying it's free, but it's not free. And there have been occasions where I talked to people in the community who had the impression that apps were free, and then they would click one button and then suddenly they subscribed to a service and it was like $15 a month. Sometimes it's not very clear what services are free or paid. Jacob says, not really, because you have to pay a subscription to actually connect with people. I don't want to pay the subscription. It should be free. Everything else in the relationship involves money, sarcastic laughter. So I don't know why I want to pay for them. And that's fair. Relationships do involve a little bit of a financial investment. The other question was the access to technology, right? We cannot take for granted that not everyone has access to smartphones or computers and internet. So Ross says, no, me got computer. When I asked him if he would be interested in using online dating if he had access to money and technology, that's what he very enthusiastically says, yeah, me want to. Another person, Leonard, also talked about this lack of access when he said, I don't have a computer. That's the problem. I don't have one. So sometimes people didn't have access to the technology to use these websites and apps, or they were not allowed to even, or they simply did not know how to navigate these spaces. Online dating is a whole different ball game from in person, right? For example, in online spaces, there's this really funny video on Twitter. I don't remember if it was Twitter, and someone says if we communicated the same way in person that we communicate online, it would be chaos. Because online, we usually say, hey, what's up? Wanna bang? Nobody comes to you right away and says those things, but in online spaces, it's almost acceptable and expected in particular spaces to hear that. So communication is totally different. So for example, Ethan says, I've heard about eHarmony, I've heard about that, but I really don't know how to get on that. And I've heard about Match, I've seen it on TV. So sometimes there is a desire from people to want to navigate the spaces, but they are just not knowing how to go about it. Like, how do I create a profile that will sell myself like in positive way? Do I disclose my disability right away and cut to the chase? Or will that decrease the chance? And I like that how people are using this language of commercialization, this almost like we're products, right? One key concept that I use a lot in my work is this notion of sexual capital, right? Sexual capital is basically the kind of attributes we have. They're helping us, become more likely to get someone at the end of the day. So we can use forms of sexual capital like our bodies, our personalities. There are all kinds of things that can help us increase our capital and increase our chances of meeting someone. Do we have any questions on the chat box so far that I'm missing? Let me know. Okay, perfect. The other thing that I've seen often is people just not being allowed to use online dating, right? Whether it's by family members, caregivers, or even staff at service providers. For example, Joshua said that he was told by his parents, I don't want Joshua using that on his phone. It won't be any good for him. Leonard also spoke about this experience. He said, I had tried that, but had not gotten me anywhere either as well. I mean, I've tried plenty of fish. I got a few messages here and there, but I really haven't had any really luck with it. My parents don't allow me to use the apps anymore anyways. They think it only brings troubles. Of course, we agree that sometimes it does bring troubles, and we want to make sure that people who are trying to navigate the spaces are feeling supported and feeling like they have someone to count on how to navigate experiences that might be tricky to navigate. I think one of the big pieces, though, is that we need to make sure that people with disabilities have decision-making power in this process, right? Part of relationships is that we kind of learn by doing a lot of times. And I'm sure if I could see all your faces here in this room, you can all look back and be like, oh my God, why did I date Michael for 2 years of my life? But we kind of accept that This is part of the process. We learn as we go, and we kind of take risks based on the information we have, right? We try to take informed risks in our dating lives. And I think there's a question in the comment here if I also interviewed women. Yes, I also interviewed women for this study, but it was interesting. I think partially because of extra protectionism that women with disabilities face in their lives, very few had access to this online experience. Even regular experiences of dating in person was not accessible to a lot of women. So I found in the study, a lot of women would say things like, I'm overly protected, or I'm not allowed to have relationships. Or even when they were able to have intimate relationships with other people with disabilities, they had very clear boundaries set. So for example, they could only hold hands with their partners, even though they had been together for 10 years, right? No sex involved in their relationships, even though they might have wanted to. So boundaries that were asserted by other people in their lives, unfortunately. The other piece that I appreciated that was one of the keywords here is the disclosure piece, right? People were very confused about when to disclose their disability or how. So, for example, some people chose to hide it. Here is an example, Scott. Oh God, I tried to hide it. I somewhat tried to hide it. Like I don't let people know until like 1 or 2 weeks into the relationship. I don't want them to look at me as any less of a person, if that makes any sense. So yeah, I don't really let them know until 1 or 2 weeks into the relationship. Yes, I have a disability. There's another one here, Clayton. He says, everybody learns in different ways, but I just sometimes feel like having a reminder of how I was treated in school for being different. Yep, back in the 80s and early 90s, there was no way to control bullying. And I think there's a question here too on the chat box. Can you read for me? I missed that one.
Yeah, absolutely. It says, when you talk about disability, are you talking about all disabilities or are you only referring to neurodiverse people?
That's a fantastic question. So for this study, we focus on developmental, intellectual disabilities, and neurodiversity. Those are the ones. And we let participants self-identify in this case, because we didn't want to we know, for example, some folks are just now going through the process of diagnosis, for example, right? And which is such a costly, difficult process. So we wanted to make sure that even if, as long as people are self-identified, that's what counted for us, if that makes sense. And we also had, on the other hand, people who chose to disclose their disabilities as quickly as possible. I'll give one example, Aaron. I try to disclose it early on because I'm involved with counseling and treatment. And if I am to be with someone, then they're going to become aware of that. A few of my days throughout the week are based on that. There's another one, Aaron continues. He says, I think a lot of the women, and I could be generalizing as well, but I think they're somewhat taken aback by that, his disability. And I'm of the belief that the more honest I am about it, that the more it is out there and the more it can be discussed. But I think definitely in the beginning of a relationship, it's a barrier. So again, people are trying to deal with the pros and cons of disclosing disability early on, right? Some people actually said that they prefer to date only neurodivergent people, or only people with disabilities because that made things so much easier. First of all, disclosure is much easier. You don't need to educate partners about disability. So some people only dated other folks with a similar lived experience. And some did try to date people without disabilities and try to go through that work as
On that note, one of our commenters asks, are there better outcomes if a neurodivergent individual uses a dating site that specializes with their demographic versus using a more generalized dating site?
Yes, that's a fantastic question. And I'll give you some more data on that very soon. But what we find is that those is more specialized websites, they're convenient in some ways, right? And they sell themselves as like, here's a space where you don't need to explain your disability to anyone, right? People just expect that you have a disability. And in some of those websites, they even allow you to say which disability you have, and you can describe your accessibility, needs and requests. So it makes it very interesting that way, where it cuts that step. And so, in some ways, it can really help increase your chances of meeting someone. But even those websites have some kind of limitations. So, for example, those websites have a very narrow vision of disability. So, for example, when you look at their logos of those dating websites, it's always like a person in a wheelchair, because that's the only image of disability that we have, right? And also, they're very heteronormative in the sense that the images are always like a pink and blue. The images of the couples are always a man and a woman, right? Even the images they use sometimes are quite disempowering in the sense of like, is someone in a wheelchair that clearly like is very like old and hospital like. It's not like some like a wheelchair that allows you to move independently or so I will give you a little bit more details very shortly. Yeah, and here's what we're talking about just now, right? Like the sexual capital people. Like, so we know that when you're creating an online dating profile, a big part of it is how you sell yourself or how you describe yourself. Usually people want to highlight their sexual capital, right? Like things that will be attractive to potential partners. And they will try to hide or minimize things that might go against their sexual capital. Most people agreed that disability usually decreased their sexual capital in these spaces. So what they did was they would prioritize talking about other things in their lives. Like Nelson, 30 years old, says, I talk more about more qualities I have. Just for example, I might say, I'm creative, I like to play sports, I like going to the gym, right? Similarly, Daniel talks about where I'm living, say that I'm working, right? What I'm looking for, hobbies. So it's kind of interesting, right? So one way that people try to kind of minimize the impact the disability had on their sexual capital was by emphasizing other aspects of their lives, right? But I play sports, but I have a job, but I have other things that kind of bring my capital up a little. Okay, let's do a fun quiz here because I love competition and I love doing quizzes. So, online dating has so many kinds of specific lingo, right? This its own language that I myself just learning these days, which is really scary. So, for example, here's a bonus question for people here. Have people heard the term zombing? What does the term zombing, like zombie, but with ing means at the end? What does that mean? Zombie. Do people know? Mm-hmm. Exactly right. Zombie. Sounds like never heard. Okay, so here's a new word for you, which I learned just like a few months ago. So zombie is kind of connected with another word, which is ghosting, right? Ghosting is when someone connects with you and then suddenly they just disappear, right? They never stop responding your messages. They completely disappear like a ghost and is gone. But zombies, those that come back after a few months or weeks. So it's almost like a zombie coming back to life. So after months or weeks, they might come back and say, "Oh my God, Teresa, how are you doing? Like, long time no see." Like, nothing happened, right? I just learned that term like months ago through my students. Anyways, here's the time for your participation on the chat box. Bot. What do we mean by bot? A fake automated account. B, a robot that creates matches. Or C, an answering machine. Let's see your knowledge of online lingo. Okay, and most people are saying A. There's one B. Okay, so there's mixed results here, N and B. So the answer is actually a fake automated account. And those are really scary because these are folks that are misrepresenting who they are. They might not even be humans, or they might be humans, but be nothing like they say they are. Not be in Canada, not be the same gender they are or sexual identity they are. And usually these profiles are created to get information from us, right? Information that helps us take advantage of us financially or in other ways. Let's try this one. Friends with benefits. That's a big deal now. A, friends that allow you to join their insurance plan. B, being friends with someone while also having sex with them. Or C, friends who you can count on for a summer pool. Okay, a lot of people saying B for this one. And I do know that a lot of people are like, oh my God, letter A and C would also be great benefits. Yes, I wish it was C, absolutely. So I totally accept all the answers, although B would be the most commonly used. Here's another one, Netflix and chill. Go home after a date to watch a movie and have popcorn. The act of comparing watch lists for Netflix on a date, or a stay-at-home date that will likely lead to sex pretty quickly, that you don't even remember what the movie was about. I'm complimenting now. Mm-hmm. There you go. Yeah. And some people are talking about like I used to think it was A before. Absolutely. Especially in the beginning, right? When this term first came out, it was extremely confusing. I must admit. Yes. Being left on red when someone sees your message and you can see that, but they don't reply. This one, I'm being generous. Don't pick B, don't pick C. And this is another one that happens very commonly and can be very frustrating and disappointing for people. Right? Especially if you have been talking to someone for a long time and then suddenly they just completely disappear. And you can see they saw your message. And it's really painful because you keep watching your phone and waiting for that answer to come. What about this emoji? And the description is three water droplets emoji. Is it time for a shower? Is it it might rain, postpone the date? Or is it things might get messy tonight? Okay, sounds like C. One of the things about emojis that are very makes things even trickier is that some emojis they have more than one meaning. And that makes it very challenging. So some people might use the same emoji to mean something else, right? It can be, let's guess, very sweaty tonight, right? Or it can be other things. So it's always tricky knowing what is the actual meaning of emojis. So this is just one example of them. Okay. Here's some things that I found very interesting that participants talked about. One of the biggest tips that people have was choosing an app or website carefully, depending on what you want, right? We know that there are tons and tons of websites. Some are more general for everyone, and some are more specialized, like the ones for people with disabilities. What they participants are telling us is that it's so important to choose a dating website or app that you know that it is trustworthy, right? That maybe someone told you is good and safe, or that you can look at rankings online. You can actually Google like the best dating websites for people with disabilities, and there will be reviews about all of them and the pros and cons. The other thing too to be very careful is that some dating apps and websites cost money, right? They might offer you like upgrades or like subscription models. And sometimes it's not quite clear that you have to pay for those, right? So always be careful with those. So, one of the things that I want to interrupt this program to recognize is that some of the spaces are ableist, right? And very problematic. So, for example, we know that some apps and websites are trying to change that. So, for example, Kinder Grinder hashtag, right, was talking about how we need to challenge racism in these apps. For a long time, and we still see that on the app sometimes, people might say no Asians or no brown people or no this, right? Or no people who are overweight or no people who are this. This very exclusionary kind of language, right? On one hand, it kind of, some people say that it's just talking about preferences, but I think there's also a problem here, right? Where we're kind of telling each other all the time that there's only one way of being normal, perfect, in quotes, right? You need to be white, you need to be non disabled, you need to be fit. Like all these ideas of beauty that many of us don't fall into. And we shouldn't, perhaps. Why can't we just appreciate difference, in many ways? Yet people are not giving up online dating, right? Even with this toxic sometimes spaces that, um, lead to negative experiences. So, for example, the question around should I go to websites that are specialized for people with disabilities? These websites often sell themselves as talking about like we're leveling the play field, right? Because now we're all equals here, right? You don't need to explain your disability. You won't be rejected because of disability. You can meet other people with disabilities. It's a more welcoming, positive experience. A lot of these websites will encourage you to disclose your relationship, like your disability, right away in your front page. So, on one hand, they can provide more conversations about disability, right? And there's so many. Datingfordisabled.com, Special Bridge, Able to Love You. Do you see some patterns here already, folks? Like, look at the wheelchairs, for example, right? In every logo almost. And the colors they use, or even the language of special, right? Like all of these things that we're still relying. So my students and I, we decided that we're going to look at all these websites for people with disabilities, and we're going to look at the images and the text on them. And what we found was by looking at text and images, for example, only 4 images had visual representation of people with intellectual disabilities. It was always people using wheelchairs and mostly men, right? We're still prioritizing sexualities of men with disabilities. It's like almost like, again, we assume that women with disabilities are not interested in sex or relationships. Even when we look at who's privileged in these spaces in terms of image and text, look at what we found. Most of the time, we see disabled men represented in these websites rather than disabled women. 100% of them were only heterosexual couples. So being queer, out of the box here, right? Or anything else. And even when we look at race, like 54 images were of white people. Only 7 of them were non-white people. So even these websites, I find fascinating is that even these websites that claim to be more welcoming and less exclusionary, they're still excluding some of us in the community. And that's also a problem. Okay, cool. So it's a lot about what is called the sexual capital in these websites, right? So I think it is important to acknowledge that it can be an ugly space and very unequal space. So for example, studies have shown that some people tend to be more successful in online dating than others. We're talking about white people or fit people, non-disabled people and all that stuff. We have studies that show this, right? We have actual data. So it's not like just imagining, but it's actual data that we have that shows these trends. And we do live in a culture where we devalue, unfortunately, disabled bodies and minds, and that penetrates. I don't know the word for this kind of disability sexuality conversation. Very interesting choice of word, but it penetrates also online dating. We have studies that also show that online dating can have negative impacts on our self-image, self-esteem, like dealing with rejection in the spaces where people feel a lot more open to talk about what they desire, what they don't, can be very scary, I think, in that way, and also needs to be acknowledged. Now, there are ways of kind of keeping ourselves safe in these spaces too. So for example, some websites require us to match with users first before we can even talk to each other, right? So you can kind of filter who you want to talk to and who is okay. Some of them, like you can talk to so many people at the same time. You can talk through multiple devices. So for example, if you don't want your parents to know you're using an online dating website, you can use it over your phone if you have one, right? There are multiple privacy settings too. So for example, caregivers and parents have a lot of concerns about, oh my God, what if my son, talks to someone who's like 16? So of course, we cannot control whether people lie in their profiles, but there are ways, for example, where we can put filters about what age we want to talk to people, right? We can choose gender, sexuality, all these kinds of filters that help us find the perfect or potential match for us. And you can even set age limits, right? If you don't want to talk to someone too young, you can do that. Also, talking to people in the community, we found that there are ways of, and I'll stop very soon for questions and comments for everyone. There are multiple ways of also trying to stay safe, right? So when you meet someone online, for example, how about finding ways to stay safe, right? Letting someone know that you trust your friend where you're going. Do not, not giving personal information or banking information. One of the things that really makes me upset in my research is the number of people who have been scammed on dating websites or social media in general. So, for example, like just last year, I was supporting this young man who basically lost $5,000, right, because of a scam in online dating. So we need to be very careful about not sending money, and if something doesn't feel right, we need to share with someone we trust, right, to support. Okay. And sometimes you click, sometimes you don't. And that's another challenge that the participants talked so much about. Some communications end so quickly. Sometimes there's no second chance, no second date, and it's so strange, right? Online dating. It makes things a lot more faster sometimes and a lot quicker to end sometimes too. Because all it takes is like, I'm gonna block Teresa. I don't want to talk anymore. And that's all it takes, right, in these days. So it can be very quick, the ending. Here's another pop quiz. Catfish. What do we mean by catfish, folks? I will send you a virtual candy if you can answer this question. someone lying. I cannot see the full comment. Would you mind reading it?
Yeah, the comment said the first one says someone lying about who they are. Next, pretending to be something you're not online. Someone else wrote Cajun cuisine. Yes, catfish. Not sure if that's the version we're talking about. Fakers, false leads, pretending to be someone else on a dating site. Lots of
Mhm.
that.
There you go. You got it, folks. You got it. Uh, Ghosting already gave you the answer, so I'm gonna avoid that one. One of the good things, though, is that I'm gonna highlight here is that there are lots of resources online now about like what are the most common scams in online spaces and how to address them. So I'm happy to share the slides with folks afterwards, and you can access all these links. So don't worry about taking notes here, right? So lots of tips about like how to avoid being taken advantage of in these spaces. So after a serious chat, let's talk about emojis. So here's the quiz, okay? I remember I gave this workshop to family members here in Alberta recently, and when I told about the eggplant one, I never forget the face of shock in the parents' faces. Like, what? How? Who did this? Who connected this vegetable with that? And it was such a big thing, right? So one of the things that we know for sure is that more and more people are using emojis to communicate with each other now, communicating emotions, communicating how they're feeling, how they're doing, their intentions, and that it's a whole new language. It's almost like a new alphabet vocabulary now, right? So it's interesting. There's a study that they did where they found the emojis that people are more likely to use and the ones they're less likely to reply to. So, for example, for women, they're less likely to respond if you send the eggplant emoji to them. you know, or for men, they're less likely if you send the ring one. So it's kind of interesting how it says we think about these things. So let's play a fun exercise here. Just a couple ones, perhaps. Um, what do we mean by number 7? What do we mean by number 7? What does that emoji mean? Celebrate. And what about the sexy version of it? What is the meaning? Let me see if I can zoom in. Oh, um, I'm not sure if I can here. I cannot see it.
Folks, you should be able to either zoom in or zoom out on your own screen
Oh, here.
as well. Oh, there you go. Yeah, perfect.
Ejaculation. Mhm. Okay. Again, there are so many ways, like some emojis have more than one meaning. Some people will use this to represent orgasm, for example. Some people might use this to represent ejaculation. So there are lots of meanings, and you got two of those. What about number 6? It's like a couple cherries. What do they mean? These two cherries here. Testicles or breasts. You got it. Virginity. Ah, yes, because we do have that whole, phrasing around pop your cherry, right? Yes, exactly. Absolutely. Look at you folks. You're very good. Like, you know what you're talking about. Again, I will share this with you, and there are lots of resources about emojis, what they mean, and how to share those, right? So it's 10, for me, it's 10:52. For you, it must be 12:52. So I'm going to open just for questions and comments at this point, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, people feel free to drop your questions in the chat. I already grabbed one from earlier that says many adults with disabilities live with caregivers, parents, or in a supportive living environment. How do we get the message to the rule makers that people with disabilities are adults, they are able to consent, and should not have these types of rules? The not under my roof rule is unfair and ridiculous under these circumstances. Who is out there informing caregivers and guiding them to best support their loved ones?
That's a fantastic question. Yes, and part of the lab that I lead, the Disability Sexuality Lab, we do a lot of training and work with service providers, for example, or training for caregivers about like we need to find a better middle ground here, at least, right? Like we understand from the caregiver perspective, like we want to make sure that people are safe. right? We know that the spaces can be dangerous, like people talked about risks and vulnerabilities. But it shouldn't mean that we're completely shutting down like opportunities for people to also make decisions in their lives. I think the answer lies in giving people more information.
Mhm.
What research shows is that the more we talk about the stuff with people with disabilities, the better people are at making well-informed decisions and take risks in their dating lives. And that's how it is, right? And so we need to be very careful about respecting the rights of people with disabilities to be able to take opportunities, take chances, and try to navigate. It won't always be a pleasurable experience or successful experience, but I think everyone should have access and the opportunity to try it at least, if that's what they want. I think the job of parents, caregivers, service providers is to make sure that people are given the information to do it safely and in the most satisfying way.
Yeah, thank you so much. Absolutely. Next question. Developmental disability and neurodivergence are very broad categories with many different intersectional experiences. Were there specific challenges for folks with different disabilities or different support needs?
Mhm. Absolutely, right? So some folks, for example, talked much more about trying to understand the scripts of dating. It was almost like there isn't like a normal way of being sexual, and I'm trying to understand what the language is, how to go about those interactions, and I'm just not getting it, right? Like that was one of the big pieces. But I also wasn't really happy to see instances where people were like, screw this scripts, I'm just gonna create my own script. For example, I never forget this young woman, who was autistic, and she said, "I like to tell jokes during sex. Why can't we tell jokes during sex?" It's funny, like in our society, we kind of have this image that sex is this serious action, right? That involves no jokes. We don't communicate. We just kind of know what we do. We figure out as we go. But what I liked about it is that a lot of a lot of participants talked about how having a disability, especially some kinds of disabilities that require more communication in advance, it made things so much more pleasurable because people were telling other partners like what hurts, what doesn't hurt, what sensory feelings are good or not, right? What parts of the body feel comfortable or not. I mean, when you look at it, like I feel like everyone in our society, including non-disabled people, would benefit from having more open discussions and be able to articulate, you know what, this position does not work for me, or this is too much stimulation for me. Here, let's take a break. Let's take a bath first. Like so what I like about it is that people with disabilities are constantly across different disability experiences and labels, people are challenging normative kind of scripts of sexuality. And that's what I like about it.
That's wonderful. And yeah, I think that communication in any type of relationship, absolutely everyone can benefit from it, no matter who you are.
Yeah.
Um, Next question, we'll just do a couple more. Are there any online dating sites for people with IDD, intellectual and developmental disabilities, that are better than others? I suppose that's asking your personal opinion.
Yeah, there are some that I've seen, like Canadian ones, for example, that have been created by people with lived experience, or even by caregivers of people with disabilities. Some of them they do tend to be, I think, a little bit better in some ways, like especially when they're created by people with lived experience. Some of those websites that I critiqued, right, in this presentation, when you try to find out who's behind them, it's usually corporations. It's companies that clearly do not know anything about disability, right? So I think to me, if I were to recommend, I wouldn't recommend a particular one, but I would recommend looking at who creates this website, who's behind them, right? Is there a clear sense of who's the creator? And if it's created by people with disabilities and family members and caregivers, I would give it a little bit more credit. I would say, if that's fair to say.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice. And then we'll go to our last question for today. Have you looked at how autistic people get more easily targeted as marks by groomers and cults who may prey on those with a traumatic sexual or relationship history?
100%, right? So one of the things that was unfortunately like so common in our interviews was the number of people who disclosed experience of abuse or harassment in previous experiences, right? People who only now, sometimes even their 30s and 40s, are even learning that those are not okay experiences or trying to make sense of it. A lot of people who are doing this work alone because they feel like they don't have they cannot talk to family members or even counselors, or they don't have access to specialists to talk about this and make sense of it. So a lot of people are navigating these experiences now, and trying to make sense of like, how did this even happen? A lot of people talking about like not knowing how to establish boundaries, right? Like for many years, like I did not know even what was okay or what was not okay. A lot of people don't have sex education even, right? Like we already have a terrible sex education in Canada. We know that, right, folks? And yet, what we see is that people with disabilities, neurodivergent people, they're also less likely to participate in sex education. There are instances where people with disabilities are automatically removed from sex education classes on the assumption that people don't need this information, people won't understand this information, right? Or they shouldn't be there. And that's another problem too. And again, the other thing too that we need to be very careful when we think about vulnerability is that we tend to take a very individualizing approach. Like I would say, Alan is vulnerable, and it's just Alan becomes labeled as vulnerable. But I think we need to also be careful how we as a society make people with disabilities more vulnerable all the time. It's a structural issue in the sense that, for example, if we don't give sex education to people with disabilities, how do you expect people to make safe or good choices in dating? Or, for example, there are so many instances in which we remove decision-making power from people with disabilities. Again, if you don't allow John to even make choices about what he eats every day, how do you expect John to make good decisions about their relationships? We remove decision-making power. We remove practices, opportunities for people to make mistakes all the time. So how do we expect people to make good decisions in their everyday lives, right? The last thing I'll say about this too is that, we understand that disability, sexuality doesn't come with a guidebook. There's no book we read that comes with all the answers, right? The whole how-to of sex and relationships. We understand that we're going to make mistakes along the way. We're going to learn from them and move on. But what I've learned consistently in the projects that I've done in this area is that people with disabilities tend to be more harshly judged and punished for making mistakes. So if someone, for example, dates someone and it doesn't go well, it automatically we say, oh, so and so is vulnerable, or so and so cannot make these decisions on their own, or so and so should not have a relationship, or so and so needs more surveillance and control in their lives. Instead of looking at the general bigger picture, right? But well, Johnny didn't even have sex education. Johnny cannot even make choices about where to go leave the house. Again, we need to look at how society we make people more vulnerable to this, right? We create vulnerability, and I think that should also be pay attention to.
Absolutely. That was a fantastic, like the perfect wrap up for this. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us today, for being interactive and participating in the chat. And a huge thanks to our guest, Dr. Alan Martino. I hope everybody enjoyed this presentation as much as we have. For the record, this presentation has been recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, along with previous presentations sometime in the near future. The link will be dropped in the chat as well as a feedback survey. If you would like to fill that out for us, it would be very helpful. So thank you so much and have a fantastic day, everybody. Bye.
Thanks for having me.